So at Open Philanthropy, our overarching goal is to phase out the worst practices for factory farming in whether it be in land or in sea. Now within that, how we do that is by following broadly this framework called the ITN framework. So the I there is impact, which is basically scale or numerosity. So number of animals that suffer. That's the first component. Then we look at tractability. Tractability is basically how solvable that problem is, or how solvable the issue is. So the more solvable, obviously, the better. And our third is neglectedness, which is pretty self-explanatory in terms of how neglected that issue or sub-strategy or cause area is. It's a very good question and something we've been trying to refine and perfect over the last 9 years. In some areas, like let's say corporate engagement, it is a little easier, where, for example, if a company like KFC makes a commitment to go cage-free, we can look at the average number of eggs they use per year and extrapolate that to the number of hens. But that's not the case in every intervention. In some areas, measuring it is way harder than others. So one thing we've tried to do in collaboration with our grantees is create effective feedback loops through these grants to identify in different sub-areas how measurable impact is. One of the ways we do this is by aligning on clear and direct goals for each grant. Some of the things we found early on during our grant making was that grantees were often confused or were on different pages about how well they were doing versus how well we thought they were doing. So by aligning on this early on and by creating effective feedback loops, and I think how to measure impact is usually for grants which have a longer theory of change, let's say like policy impact, legislative impact. So those are ones we've refined over time. Some cases are grant making, impact and tractability or how solvable a problem is could be at odds. So for example, the EU and the US constitute about 2/3 of our grant making, whereas our grant making in Asia is about 1/4 of our total portfolio. But the number of animals raised in Asia is about 2/3 and fewer in the West. However, because interventions are more tractable or historically have been more tractable in the EU and the US, we have focused more of our grant making there. But our hope is that some of our initial investments or through grants in Asia creates a seed for long-term change. Moreover, in areas where grant making is more, let's say, intractable or less solvable, one of the things we've also tried to do is, while we're making any grant in these regions, we try and answer one of 3 questions. Is this grant going to lead to direct welfare benefit in the short term? If it does, well and good, go for it, it's probably tractable. But very often we'll see in developing regions that's not the case. So then we try and answer the second and third question. Will this grant increase the likelihood of, let's say, direct welfare benefit in the medium term? That's, let's say, 5 to 10 years. Then we may make that grant. Or if not that, will this grant increase the likelihood of legislative change on a more longer term, let's say 20 years? That's another way we make that grant. So the exact percentages of long-term versus short-term grant making keep varying over time. But I think we're reaching a stage where at least we have clearly defined criteria for that. Getting funding from the climate movement for all proteins, I think that's something that we've seen an exponential growth of in the last year or two. For example, the Bezos Earth Fund has committed about $100 million US for all proteins. Novo Nordisk Foundation, the largest foundation in the world, has also set up an action plan, set up an initiative to boost plant-based food. This is something that we think may be a major boost for animal advocacy, including alternative proteins. Another thing is, I think, government giving for high welfare farming and for all proteins. So in the last year or so, in the last few years, the EU, UK, Germany, and Denmark have all created funds to incentivize high welfare farming. Similarly, there has been an increase in government funding for all protein as well. So I think if we look at the current amount of government funding committed to research and commercialization of all protein, that's about 1.67 or 1.7 billion US. If you look at where that was in 2020, it was about 118 million US or so. So I think if we include all protein and government funding, these are some of the important trends to look out for that are taking off at the moment. I think animal advocacy events like AVA and SOT have a huge role to play in developing regions like Southeast Asia. I think one of the things that they most contribute to is helping to retain talent, but also attract new talent. I think having advocates from groups come here, network, learn from each other, build scope for cooperation and coordination with each other is a big source. That being said, I think capacity building or talent building in Southeast Asia and other developing regions has been one of the big roadblocks, I think, in helping this movement mature or evolve more. And I've seen personally from my experiences here at AVA that there are a bunch of advocates who are not within the movement, who are keen to join the movement. I think that is another big role that AVA plays in these regions. Similarly, I think a second very important, crucial role that AVA or that events like AVA play is essentially building coordination between existing groups, so setting up one-on-one chats with each other. I think because most of our work is pretty virtual right now, these events provide a platform for one-on-one chats, for greater coordination, whether it be strategy building. I think another thing that I've seen is these groups often schedule, let's say, their retreats or strategy workshops or roundtables around these events, so that's another great thing. And thirdly, I think on a more human level, it's just connection. At least personally for me, and I know for many advocates as well, so much of our work ends up being remote, and you just look at a computer screen throughout. I personally felt very rejuvenated and energized by meeting advocates in person, even if we don't talk shop. So I think, these are the three that come to mind for me.